animals were among the first subjects sketched by humans. Many cave paintings depict either animals or thumbprints, an anatomical feature that distinguishes us in zoological classification. It is likely that the need to understand the diversity of the animal world initially met a practical imperative, such as distinguishing the edible from the toxic or the fierce from the docile, but also served artistic motivations. Long before the work of Darwin or Crick and Watson, our ancestors were fascinated by the visual similarities and differences among the creatures around them. Early scholars probably sensed that a general principle unified all forms of life. Their classification attempts often reveal more about their own ideas than about the animal world they sought to organize. The history of zoological classification has generated a frequently redundant jargon. Most of the time, the terms classification, taxonomy, and systematics refer to the same concept, the identification of species and their organization. Scientists make subtle distinctions between these terms, but few pay much attention to them. The term phylogenetic refers to classifications based on common ancestors and genealogical relationships among animals. Phylogeny means origin of the tribe, implying that animals have diversified through an evolutionary process. Phonetics, on the other hand, studies the similarities and differences among living beings without considering their evolutionary relationships. This approach was popular before the acceptance of the theory of evolution and is still used when observations do not reveal evolutionary links. Evolutionary biology, in contrast, encompasses the study of evolutionary processes, the origin of life, species modification over time, divergences between species, speciation, and the factors influencing these processes, without focusing on animal classification itself.
God formed from the soil all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Each was to bear the name the man would give it. The man gave names to all the domesticated animals, the birds of the sky, and all the wild beasts, but for the man, he did not find a helper suitable for him.
Zoology holds a significant place in the scriptures. The earliest systems of naming and classifying animals come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Adam was created on the same day as the beasts of the earth, a surprising nod to the modern concept of humans as animals, and one of his first tasks was to name the animals. Interestingly, God only created Eve because non-human creatures were unsuitable companions and helpers for Adam. Particularly due to the dietary restrictions concerning certain animals, biblical animal classification prevailed for a long time. For instance, Leviticus chapter 11 contains what we would now call decision trees regarding the choice of edible animals, mentioning criteria such as whether they have split hooves and chew the cud, or whether aquatic animals have fins and scales. These rules may have arisen from health issues related to microbial or parasitic contamination, and they persisted in Jewish dietary laws. These practical injunctions, which were once seen as life or death signals, inspired early classifications. Another source of Western zoological classifications comes from the Greeks, whose views, driven more by enlightened curiosity than survival needs, seem surprisingly modern. Most of their thoughts on biology are summarized in Aristotle's natural philosophy, though it is hard to distinguish his actual discoveries from those borrowed from often uncredited predecessors. Aristotle lived on Lesbos, one of the largest islands in the Aegean Sea. His descriptions of the island's fauna, especially the animals in its warm, shallow waters, form the basis of his writings. He emphasized that his works were based on observing nature, not repeating the errors of his predecessors, which is mostly true. For each animal he encountered, he analyzed its specific traits and deduced its affinities with other creatures. He recognized that while many characteristics are common to all animals, features like coloration, shape, or size are unreliable criteria for grouping them. Instead, he advocated organizing animals by their diet, habitat, behavior, respiration, possible metamorphoses, social or solitary nature, nocturnal or diurnal habits, domestication status, aggressiveness or timidity, egg-laying or live birth, and whether they were stationary or mobile in the sea. However, Aristotelian thought was not as modern as often claimed. Despite delivering the first known scientific classification of animals, Aristotle remained tied to the metaphysical system he imposed on the world. He was one of the early proponents of the great chain of being, which hierarchically ranked creatures from plants to animals, then humans, and finally gods. Although inconsistent with the abundant animal diversity he described, this strict hierarchy formed the basis of many subsequent classifications up until the 19th century. Comfortingly, Aristotle placed humans above other animals, close to the gods' perfection. Yet, he sometimes contradicted himself when considering humans as other animals, remaining a staunch supporter of the great chain of being. Another landmark in the journey towards modern zoological classifications is the Physiologus, written anonymously, probably in the 2nd century AD in Alexandria. It presents various North African animals, complemented by North European species and mythical creatures, forming a rich menagerie with theological lessons. Imbued with Christian doctrine, this work described 40 animals identified less by their zoological features and more by their associated religious symbols. Each creature thus played a role in the Christian narrative, often derived from Greek parables illustrating particular theological principles. In this religious bestiary, animals primarily represented the Word, and zoology was seen as part of theology, compromising the logical development of this science for centuries. The Etymologies by Isidore of Seville marked a unique detour in zoological traditions at the beginning of the 7th century. This colossal work is one of the earliest encyclopedic compilations of knowledge, but it was marred by the persistence of ancient concepts. As the title of his work suggests, Isidore believed that understanding the hidden meaning of names revealed certain inherent qualities of the named entities, and vice versa. Thus, to him, what was elephantine was directly related to the great gray pachyderm. A modern reader might simply assume that an animal could be named by analogy or that the name of an animal could be used metonymically. In the long history of zoological classifications, the Etymologies is probably the quintessential example of an organization of the animal world whose logic surpasses the understanding available at the time. Regardless, this book, which was tirelessly reprinted during the medieval period in Europe and the Islamic world, had a considerable influence. These texts were the forerunners of the classifications that appeared at the end of the Middle Ages. Aristotelian thought, Isidore's obsession with names, and a Christianity centered on its own logic inspired one of the most spectacular artistic representations of zoological organization, the bestiary. Bestiaries flourished in the Middle Ages, especially in France, England, and Scotland during the 12th and 13th centuries. Although their sophistication varied, their structure and purpose were remarkably consistent. Whether their authors were inspired by ancient texts or contemporary observations, their evolution is itself a subject of study, with these works forming families with their own genealogy. Spectacular iconography made bestiaries accessible to the illiterate masses. It is likely that readers did not question the creatures depicted. These animals had a meaning that transcended their physical appearance, and their real existence mattered less than what they conveyed about God. Their symbolism remained simplistic. Some animals, particularly those most familiar to medieval readers, sometimes had multiple roles. A goat, for instance, could represent a sinner consumed by the flames of hell in one context, then the omniscient Christ in another. Mapmonds also became popular in the Middle Ages. These giant maps stylized the geography of the known world. Most of them positioned the three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, around a centrally placed Jerusalem, reflecting the central position of God. On the periphery, strange lands were depicted, populated by exotic and monstrous creatures, often distortions of real animals, or devilish chimerae that were part beast, part human, meant to frighten believers. The most striking examples of these zoological curiosities are found on the margins of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, where creatures with dog heads or cynocephaly, perhaps inspired by baboons, frolic. This conception evolved starting from the Renaissance, when the religiosity of medieval bestiaries gave way to more objective observations. The 16th century saw the dissemination of publications such as the detailed Historia Animalium by the Swiss philosopher Conrad Gessner. 50 years later, Ulysses Aldrovandi followed with his vast collection of zoological curiosities in Bologna, leading to works like De Piscibus and Ornithologia among many other books. The importance of animal diversity ended the concept of the great chain of being, whose successive degrees became less apparent, and whose hierarchy seemed simplistic. This linear gradation transformed into a branching tree and other forms more singular than medieval artists would have dared to imagine. The origins of the Mesopotamian flood myths are likely over 5,000 years old and remain unknown. While a universal flood is impossible, these myths might have been inspired by the flooding in the Tigris and Euphrates basins or could reflect the rise in sea levels after the last ice age. The present-day Persian Gulf may once have been a dry, uninhabited land. Adapting this universal myth, the biblical Genesis describes the flood. The Lord said to Noah,
"Go into the ark, you and your whole family, for I have found you righteous in this generation. Of all clean animals, you shall take 7 pairs, a male and its female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made."
The monumental scale of Noah's adventure and his methodical categorization of animals, clean and unclean, male and female, to save all living creatures, served as an incredible source of inspiration for medieval illuminators. One superb example is found in the Psalm Le Roi. This manual of moral and religious instruction was written at the request of Philip the Bold by his Dominican confessor, Brother Laurent Dubois, in 1279. Clearly, depicting the ark was challenging. Each species was confined to a small, monastic-like cell where it barely fit. As a result, many medieval representations of the ark resembled scientific tables, such as the periodic table of elements, more than seaworthy vessels capable of withstanding the deluge. Jan Johnston was a Scottish-born naturalist and physician who lived in Poland and traveled extensively throughout Northern Europe. His zoological observations were authoritative for a century. In the mid-17th century, he completed one of his major works, A Natural History of Insects, Bloodless Marine Animals, Fish, Whales, and Birds. This comprehensive and precise work greatly benefited from the exceptional contributions of Swiss-born engraver Maria Merian. Coming from a wealthy family in Basel, Merian was not only an artist but also a renowned publisher. His engravings, notable for their delicacy, conveyed a deep sensitivity to the animals depicted, which seemed to leap or fly off the page. Merian passed away at the age of 56, but his children turned out to be even more talented artists. His daughter Maria surpassed him in influence. Our current understanding of animal classification draws from three concepts that emerged gradually. These three key ideas included accepting the notion of evolution, recognizing the considerable time required to create the animal complexity we know today, and understanding natural selection as the mechanism driving evolutionary processes. These concepts did not emerge simultaneously as a coherent set, but gradually developed as evidence accumulated and minds loosened from the constraints of religious dogma. In the Enlightenment era, many scientists began to realize that the biblical narrative of an all-powerful God creating all animal species in a week at the beginning of a world that might be only a few thousand years old could not correspond to reality. Looking back, the 18th century truly marked a turning point in biological history. Naturalists started to question the diversity of animal life as discoveries around the globe suggested almost infinite diversity, and the accumulation of fossils indicated that the animal kingdom had already been incredibly diversified in ancient times. Throughout this century, zoology transitioned from a finite catalogue of God's creation to a complex array reflecting the surprising diversity of animal life. By the early 19th century, ideas of evolution and paleontology were already causing significant controversy, though the concept of natural selection would emerge a bit later. The idea of evolution appeared much earlier than commonly thought, with remarkably progressive theories formulated earlier within the scientific community of Western Europe. In antiquity, Greek philosophers had suggested that life had originally emerged on Earth from inanimate matter, that animals had changed over time, and even that terrestrial animals derived from aquatic ancestors. Moreover, some speculated that fossils bore witness to the existence of ancient animals lost in immemorial times, possibly due to environmental catastrophes like massive floods. Similarly, philosophers in the medieval Islamic world proposed that animals evolved over time, driven by a struggle for existence, a notion not far removed from modern theories of natural selection. Furthermore, they suggested that this evolution occurred in a shifting world where geography could radically change, with land turning into sea and vice versa. In Western Europe, a pivotal step towards modern classifications occurred in the late 17th century with John Ray at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge. Often regarded as the father of the concept of species, this naturalist developed a systematic approach to organizing living organisms based on their characteristics. His groupings of animals did not rely on an evolutionary concept and cannot be interpreted as phylogenetic trees, but they reflected new objectives. For instance, based on anatomical considerations, Ray argued that whales were mammals and not fish. He also proposed a classification of insects based on their biological cycle and metamorphosis. Although more widely known, the subsequent period can be considered conceptually regressive, despite leading to the development of the animal classification system still in use today. Swedish biologist Petri Artedi initiated this work with his posthumously published Philosophia Ichthyologia in 1738, where he developed a hierarchical system resembling the modern framework of genera, families, orders, and classes. His colleague Carl Linnaeus expanded Artedi's concepts to apply to other animals, plants, and even minerals. This culminated in the extensive Systema Naturae of 1735, in which Linnaeus sought to organize living organisms and minerals into a coherent system. While the ranks of his hierarchy are arbitrary concepts, his system proved so satisfactory that it remains relevant. Linnaeus also introduced the binomial nomenclature system for naming living organisms. For example, man quickly became known as Homo sapiens. Crucially, the dispassionate inclusion of man in this system itself represented one of the most significant scientific innovations of the time. The pivotal figure in this scientific revolution was Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, who, in the mid-18th century, endeavored to explain the relationships between living organisms and the origins of life on Earth. He studied the possibility that life originated from inanimate matter, while also delving into the cognitive abilities of animals and extinct species revealed by fossils. Buffon was the first to divide Earth's history into a sequence of prehistoric eras. Going further, based on the physics and paleontology knowledge of his time, Buffon estimated the age of the Earth to be at least 50,000 to 70,000 years, a notion inconceivable to those who strictly adhered to biblical accounts. Observing that fossilized animals were often found far from where similar animals lived in his time, he deduced that fauna changed locally over time and suggested that migrations could explain these changes. Buffon proposed that morphological characteristics of animals could result not from divine creation but from adaptation to new environments. As if that were not enough, Buffon was among the first to conceive illustrations depicting relationships among animals. He envisioned a network of similarities between lineages of dogs that still seems modern today, though it did not resemble an evolutionary tree, perhaps because, unlike wild species, dog breeds had not diverged to the point where they could no longer interbreed. Long before the discovery of genes and DNA, Buffon thus conceived a modern biology. By the late 18th century, this process continued. In his Elenchus Zoophytorum of 1766, Prussian zoologist Peter Simon Pallas posited that relationships among living beings could not be reduced to an idealized linear scale but should instead be based on a network or tree model. He described the living kingdom as a tree trunk splitting into two, plants and animals, each of these half-trunks consisting of generic species, with branches and ramifications leading to more specialized types. Shortly after, in 1785, James Hutton questioned the age of the Earth in his Theory of the Earth. He argued that most processes shaping the planet's surface, such as erosion, sedimentation, and occasional events like volcanism, indicated that Earth must be much older than a few thousand years. This theme was further developed in 1816 by self-taught geologist William Smith in Strata Identified by Organized Fossils. Smith meticulously studied fossils extracted from British sediments and noted that each rock layer or stratum revealed unique remnants of different fauna. He pondered whether gaps observed in these fossil successions reflected incomplete discoveries or, more likely, mass extinctions in a distant past. In sum, the world then appeared far older than previously imagined by humankind. The idea of portraying evolution as a branching tree seemed apparent from that time onward, yet naturalists took decades to embrace this representation, preferring a classificatory system instead. Their reluctance likely reflected the fact that the modern tree model, now familiar, required accepting explanations about the origin and evolution of animals that many were not yet ready to endorse. The very first tree dealt with plants rather than animals. In 1801, Augustine Augier's botanical tree attempted to compare plants based on clearly defined criteria. However, it did not aim to establish genealogical relationships or imagine changes in plant morphology over time. Nevertheless, the choice to draw a tree was not merely aesthetic, and Augier placed considerable importance on the idea that different plant species share equivalent characteristics or have similar features performing the same biological functions. Thus, Augier contemplated questions related to evolution without ever admitting its existence. He also suggested that such an approach could be applied to animals. 8 years later, the first phylogenetic tree of animals appeared in a rudimentary form in Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's Philosophie zoologique. Unlike Augier, Lamarck firmly believed that the variations he observed among animals could only be explained by evolution. Therefore, his trees undoubtedly implied that species changed and diverged over time. He persisted in this concept. His later trees had more branches and gained assurance as dotted lines were replaced with bold, black lines. Unfortunately, Lamarck is often ridiculed today for proposing evolutionary processes that are incompatible with current understanding. Although he correctly perceived the environment as a significant driver of evolution, he believed it acted by modifying the degree to which an animal used different organs or tissues, affecting their development and transmitting these changes to offspring. He also clung to the centuries-old idea that all organisms tended toward some form of perfection, even if he viewed it as an evolutionary process rather than divine determinism. Nonetheless, Lamarck's errors are minimal compared to the relevance of his views on the physical transmission of traits across generations and his profound influence on subsequent biologists. Maria Merian was a woman of inspiration. Born into a talented family of artists, she was the daughter of Matthias Merian and from a young age showed a passion for watercolor painting. Starting with plants and flowers, Maria quickly moved on to painting insects that fed on them. Her interest shifted from plants to insects, particularly observing caterpillars, voracious leaf-eaters whose metamorphosis into butterflies deeply impressed the devout young girl, symbolizing to her the relationship between humans and God. Maria was a true scientist credited with numerous entomological observations. She provided compelling evidence that contributed to Francesco Redi's refutation of the spontaneous generation of insects from inert matter. Establishing herself in the Netherlands, the energetic Maria embarked with her sister Dorothea to the Suriname rainforest in South America to pursue her passion for entomology. Their work culminated in the impressive 1705 publication Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium. A savvy businesswoman, Maria published it in both Dutch and Latin, in monochrome and color versions, with a subscription system for early buyers. Maria did not hesitate to candidly denounce the living conditions in the colonies, including the suicides and abortions of slaves seeking to escape their owners' cruelty. Her outspokenness, both socially and scientifically, did not prevent her work from being criticized and overlooked in the 19th century. One of her famous illustrations, depicting a tarantula killing a hummingbird, was widely interpreted as a feminist metaphor but is now recognized as an accurate observation. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came from a noble but financially struggling family in the mid-17th century. At the age of 17, he traveled to southern France where he enlisted as a soldier. It was during this time that he developed a deep fascination for the flowers growing in the parched soil of the region. He began studying medicine but was discouraged by one of his brothers. Lamarck then started working at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris and published an extensive classification of French plants, enabling their identification through dichotomous keys similar to those developed by John Ray. It was likely these keys, foreshadowing modern decision trees, along with his diverse professional pursuits, that led Lamarck to his greatest contribution to biology. Upon being appointed at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, Lamarck could not join the botany department as its chairs were already held by renowned professors. Instead, he established a new department dedicated to invertebrates. Intrigued by striking similarities among many species, he soon embraced the then controversial idea that organisms evolved over time. Lamarck wasn't the first to propose this hypothesis, but his work was among the most influential. Boldly, he suggested that natural, physical forces drove this evolution, an internal force propelling animals to achieve higher levels of complexity over time, and an external environmental force causing species to diverge and diversify. Unfortunately, Lamarck's errors marred his legacy. He believed in spontaneous generation of elementary life from inert matter and thought events occurring during an animal's life could affect the morphology of its descendants. These mistakes now seem minor, as Lamarck lacked knowledge of genetics and molecular biology. He deserves credit for being the first to formulate hypotheses explaining the mechanism behind biodiversity. Today, paleontology and the study of evolution are branches of biology, although these disciplines have their origins in geology. 19th-century geologists discovered that the placement of fossils in successive layers of sedimentary rocks chronicles the timeline of animal evolution. These deposits constitute the pages of the Great Book of Animal History. A pivotal figure in understanding this phenomenon, one of the most decisive steps in the history of science, was the Englishman William Strata Smith. Great Britain is an ideal territory for studying the stratification of ancient rocks. Despite its limited area, it boasts a nearly complete series of diagonally aligned strata ranging from some of the oldest layers in the world in northwest Scotland to some of the most recent in southeast England. Furthermore, geology became fashionable in the 18th century, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution marked by canal digging and mining development. William Smith, a self-educated topographer from humble origins, quickly understood that fossils were specific to certain sediment layers, and that the presence of particular species in sediments allowed deductions about the time of their deposition. In just a few years, Smith published the first comprehensive geological maps and 2 detailed catalogues correlating sedimentary layers with their characteristic fossils, strata identified by organized fossils, and the stratigraphical system. Publishing these richly illustrated books at his own expense depleted his earnings, and he was at one point imprisoned for debt. William Smith died in poverty. The theory of natural selection marked a pivotal moment in the history of zoological classification. It was simultaneously formulated in the mid-19th century by 2 English naturalists, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. The theory of natural selection is both satisfying and simplistic. Individual characteristics within an animal species vary, and these traits are inherited from their parents. If these traits provide an advantage, they are preferentially passed on to future generations. As a result, species gradually acquire new traits and, over a sufficiently long period of evolution, they progressively differentiate into multiple species. The diversity and complexity of life are conditioned by this process. In the decades preceding and following the publication of the theory of natural selection, the most spectacular iconography ever created on the organization of the animal kingdom emerged. Illustrations before the discovery were fascinating but incomplete. Those developed once naturalists grasped the relevance of the new theory were no less impressive. During the first half of the 19th century, accumulating evidence suggested that the Earth was significantly older than suggested by the Bible. This was crucial for naturalists because, given the gradual nature of evolution, its completion required an old planet. Although not the originator of this hypothesis, Scottish geologist Charles Lyell is often regarded as a central figure in reconciling geology with biology. Lyell advocated uniformitarianism, the theory positing that processes and forces that occurred in the distant past continued over extremely long periods to the present day. In his Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, Lyell described his work, demonstrating that the vertical stacking of kilometers of sediments and the conical accumulations of scoriae in lava from vast volcanoes could only have formed over immense periods of time, given the unchanging nature of these processes. Darwin carried this book aboard the HMS Beagle, and Lyell's work influenced the young naturalists' ideas on animal evolution. We now know that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old and has hosted life for 80% of this time. However, the question of whether the ancient Earth was analogous to the one known or if it had been constantly disrupted by catastrophes troubled geologists since the 18th century. Evidence of significant climatic fluctuations was brought by Swiss geologist Louis Agassiz's discovery of glaciations in his Studies on Glaciers in 1840. Glaciers produce characteristic U-shaped erosions in valleys and mobilize, then deposit erratic blocks in incongruous places. Agassiz hypothesized that glaciers once extended to the Caspian and Mediterranean seas. He embarked on a journey to the United States in 1846 to find evidence for his theory. However, his career took an unexpected turn when he became embroiled in controversies over nature, hybridization, and the origins of human races. He supported the concept of phylogenetism, arguing that human types constituted different species, a theory that bolstered arguments for slavery. The tradition of creating visual catalogues of animals persisted throughout the 19th century. Exploration of unknown territories and new research methods revealed an ever-increasing diversity to the naturalist artists of this period. Two works stand out prominently from this era. The first is the monumental work by John James Audubon. Published between 1827 and 1838, The Birds of America features 435 watercolor paintings comprehensively portraying these animals with both detail and a sense of fondness. Adding to its significance, Audubon depicted them life-sized, requiring each page to accommodate even an eagle comfortably. The second notable work was by John Gould and Henry Constantine Richter, published from 1845 to 1863, The Mammals of Australia, which brought together for European and American readers the diversity of marsupials and monotremes from the antipodes. Though less extensive than Audubon's opus, this work exhibits high artistic quality and reveals great empathy for the animals. These unique creatures seldom seemed as playful, proud, or timid. The gaze of some appears sad and resigned, as if they already knew they would disappear a century and a half later. Between the early and mid-19th century, new observations accumulated at a remarkable pace. In 1823, human and mammoth bones were discovered together in a Welsh cave, suggesting these two species coexisted. In 1844, journalist Robert Chambers anonymously published the controversial work Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, discussing the formation of the solar system, the origins of life on Earth, human origins, and how animal species could diversify with increasing complexity. Calculating in 1862 the kinetics of planetary cooling, Lord Kelvin estimated an age between 20 and 100 million years, though these substantial figures did not satisfy some uniformitarians who argued for an infinitely ancient Earth. During this period, embryologists and paleontologists, particularly in France and what is now Germany, developed ambitious frameworks that integrated knowledge of fossil history, the embryonic development of animals, and this new science called evolution. It was within this intellectual ferment that two English naturalists were poised to revolutionize biology. Born in 1809, Charles Darwin quickly redirected his interest from medicine to natural history. During his voyage aboard HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836, he gained renown as a zoologist. He communicated on the existence of marine fossils found in high sedimentary layers in remote mountainous regions, alongside clearly extinct animal bones next to modern-looking mollusk shells, on the apparent stability of the Earth, on the single origin of all humans, and most significantly, on the subtle variations among finches from the Galapagos Islands. He likely began to conceive his theory of natural selection around 1838 and formulated it in 1844 in an unpublished article. Born in 1823, Alfred Russel Wallace traveled to Brazil from 1848 to 1852, then to what is now Malaysia and Indonesia from 1854 to 1862, collecting and studying thousands of specimens. It was during these explorations that he began to develop his theory of natural selection. In 1855, he described affinity relationships, drawing branches as intertwined as the boughs of a gnarled oak, and began to conceive a genealogical tree of animal species. More a geographer than a zoologist, Wallace had an equal passion for the animals' habitats, ecology, and distribution. Indeed, he became one of the promoters of the field of biogeography as it is known today. Darwin and Wallace each published on their theory in 1858. Encouraged by what he had read in Wallace's early works, Darwin published On the Origin of Species on November 24, 1859. Throughout the maturation of their conception of natural selection, the two naturalists encouraged each other, and Darwin often emphasized how much their thoughts converged. They corresponded throughout their lives, while their ideas revolutionized the scientific world. Darwin's notebooks and his Origin present surprisingly modern trees schematizing relationships among animal species, albeit in small numbers. For instance, Origin contains only one drawing, somewhat an arboreal sort. Darwin probably believed this type of representation was already well known enough to establish itself as the preferred illustration of relationships among species. He suggested, however, that a coral might provide a better analogy, as polyps grow at the end of a substrate made of dead ancestors and not of a living branch. In fact, the first modern phylogenetic tree was published a year before Origin, unnoticed, in Heinrich Georg Braun's Principles of the Development of the Organic World. In some respects, this Teutonic foreshadowing announced the trees of another German, Ernst Haeckel, a fervent supporter of Darwin, who would become the most prolific creator of such trees in history. Edward Hitchcock personified the struggle between science and religion in the 19th century. As a young devout pastor, he embarked on a career as a geologist and paleontologist, which forced him to confront the contradictions between science and theology. Appointed professor of chemistry and natural history at Amherst College at the age of 32, he also participated in major state geological projects. It became evident to him that the chronology of the Bible fundamentally conflicted with his geological observations. In his effort to reconcile the apparent age of the earth with the Genesis account of a world created a few thousand years ago, he developed his own reinterpretation of religious texts. He concluded that creation could not have occurred in 6 literal days and that the flood did not explain sediment stratification or fossil deposits. Thus, Hitchcock proposed that the days of creation were instead periods, analogous to what we now recognize as geological eras. Nevertheless, he maintained that God remained the creator of living organisms and the driving force behind their evolution. Although he described changes in species and their extinction in a paleontological framework strongly resembling a tree, Hitchcock refused to accept that these upheavals could have purely terrestrial causes. Similarly, he asserted that humans shared no common ancestor with other animals. The works of Darwin and Wallace ultimately undermined Hitchcock's scientific religious theory in the later years of his life. With the Earth unquestionably ancient, it was natural selection that drove changes in its inhabitants, not the hand of God. After the publication of On the Origin of Species, none of Hitchcock's subsequent editions contained the elegant and influential paleontological chart. Before the discovery of natural selection by Darwin and Wallace, biologists extensively pondered the origins of humanity. Most, like modern biologists, already believed that humans shared a common ancestor and were all related. The ability of representatives from various ethnic groups to interbreed and produce healthy, fertile offspring already indicated that humans constituted a single species. However, during a brief period in the mid-19th century, one individual managed to cast doubt on the monogenetic origin of humans. Josiah Nott, a surgeon in Mobile and a staunch advocate of slavery, dominated what was then known as the American School of Ethnology. Social relations in America at that time fueled debates over the existence of human races and their relative superiority more than in Europe, largely due to pervasive slavery and efforts to justify its continuation. Knott rejected the idea of evolution and reverted to an animal classification presented as a bestiary more in line with his approach. He was among the most fervent proponents of phylogenetism, the theory that different human races were separately created entities by God. Disregarding scientific evidence and publications by others, Knott likened individuals from the union of different ethnic groups to types of mules. He claimed that Genesis only recounted the history of a small group of men descended from a white Caucasian, Adam. Knott asserted that everything pointed to the justification for white men to dominate black men, arguing that their natural condition destined them for enslavement. Phylogenetism faded into obscurity, and with Darwin's theories definitively undermining its credibility, Knott ceased his work. However, phylogenetism and racial theories did not completely disappear, unfortunately persisting to some extent even today. Alfred Russel Wallace, the Welsh naturalist and explorer, was one of the two architects, alongside Charles Darwin, of the theory of natural selection. He also integrated animal classifications into geography and history. Unlike Darwin, Wallace lacked the financial security from marriage but managed to finance a more adventurous life. Influenced by his discoveries of new lands, he joined an expedition to uncharted regions of the Amazon in the late 1840s and embarked on an 8-year journey through present-day Malaysia and Indonesia, a trip that would shape his career. In a feverish night in 1858, Wallace suddenly realized the concept of species evolving. He promptly wrote to Darwin, with whom he had corresponded for years and shared similar views on the natural world. From then on, it was challenging to distinguish the contributions of the two naturalists to the theory of natural selection. They exchanged extensive correspondence, mutually reinforcing their observations, and both published papers in 1858, a year before the release of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Wallace remained a devoted admirer of Darwin and did not resent his own lesser fame. In addition to his pivotal role in the theory of natural selection, which is often underestimated, Wallace founded the science of biogeography, the study of the past and present geographic distribution of animals. He collaborated with the English zoologist Philip Sclater, identifying the 6 faunal regions still recognized today. He observed the Wallace Line, a virtual boundary he identified himself, which separates the Indo-Malayan and Australasian faunal regions, distinguishing the animal fauna of Borneo and Bali to the west from that of Sulawesi and Lombok to the east. Ernst Haeckel, a professor of zoology at the University of Jena, was a prominent figure in 19th-century zoology. Going beyond Darwin, he developed his own radical version of Darwinism. Originally an artist strongly influenced by German Romantics, Haeckel traveled extensively, collecting and painting specimens that would later illustrate his theories on evolution and natural selection. He amassed a veritable menagerie of skeletons and embryos, and his exquisite illustrations adorned art schools throughout Europe. He was notably clear for his time in asserting that humans are just one species among many. His zoological classifications were based on the idea that all life forms descend from a single, simple ancestor. Consequently, his phylogenetic trees all have a single trunk, with humans occupying the crown. Haeckel focused extensively on the origin of life and studied the simplest creatures. He made observations on the progressive nature of evolutionary processes and the links between evolution and embryonic development, at a time when embryology was rapidly advancing. He believed that evolution progressed towards perfection, but he is also remembered for extending his theories to human races and religions. It is surprising that the artist who produced such beautiful zoological illustrations also wrote that Judaism was an intermediary between primitive paganism and an evolved Christianity, and that non-Europeans were physiologically closer to mammal types like monkeys or dogs than civilized Europeans, and thus should be assigned a completely different value in life. Although his writings were later partially embraced by Nazi ideology, Haeckel's art remains a testament to the grand tradition of 19th-century naturalistic classifications. Since 1900, zoology has undergone significant changes. Animal classification benefits from an unprecedented wealth of scientific data. Both the types of information and the new methods of analysis are more abundant than ever before. The advancements in zoological classifications necessitate more inventive strategies for illustrating all available information. Not only do species change and diversify over time, but so do genes, chromosomes, and genomes. The sequencing of an organism's DNA in 24 hours now yields more knowledge about it than can be captured in a single image. Animal classification no longer relies solely on evolutionary data. It encompasses ecological, biogeographical, geological, biophysical data, as well as insights from conservation biology and many other disciplines. Undoubtedly, developments in genetics have revolutionized zoology the most. This upheaval began with Gregor Mendel's work in the mid-19th century, though its true significance was recognized only decades later. Mendel's groundbreaking research on the mechanisms of heredity was published shortly after Darwin's On the Origin of Species, but its publication in the obscure Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brno meant it was rediscovered in the early 20th century. It was then necessary to wait until the structure of DNA was elucidated, the genetic code decrypted, and powerful DNA sequencing techniques developed from the 1950 to the 1970 years for zoologists to fully exploit genomic knowledge. The entire genome of an animal was sequenced in the 1990 years, and today it is feasible to analyze the genomes of numerous individuals within a population. It took decades to acknowledge the importance of Mendel's work, to discover the role of DNA in transmitting genetic information, and to understand how this information shapes an organism's development and controls its functions. During this pivotal period, 20th-century biologists worked on animal classifications, some exploiting genetic data, others moving beyond it. By the 1920 years, it became evident that animal diversity was not as straightforward as envisioned by the great zoologists of the 19th century. Studies of marine organisms revealed that Ernst Haeckel's emphatic theories did not withstand scrutiny, and observations of geological strata showed that parts of various animals sometimes fossilized unexpectedly. Scientists began questioning Darwin's and Wallace's theories. What is the speed of natural selection? Is it gradual or does it proceed in leaps? Is the history of evolution driven by mutations? Does animal diversification always progress in a branching pattern? Gradually, firmly rooted phylogenetic trees themselves began to be questioned. Indeed, mid-20th century trees differ from their tortuous 19th century ancestors. Their silhouettes with gently curved branches have a hint of Art Deco and often resemble real trees. In their legends, the falsely antique characters have disappeared, replaced by a sans serif typographic style. Clear and precise, these new trees provide objective data reflecting the desire to organize the animal kingdom according to the rigorous demands of modern science. Nevertheless, many naturalists continued to classify animals using techniques from their 19th century predecessors. Paleontology, the study of ancient forms, continued to form the basis of phylogeny until surprisingly recent times. For example, the numerous dinosaur fossils discovered in North America were arranged based on the tuberosities of their bones and joints, and the gradual evolution towards mammals was traced through the study of teeth and small bones of the inner ear. Even distantly related species were classified almost exclusively based on morphological criteria. In short, anatomy continued to dominate the question well into the second half of the 20th century. The sinuosity of 19th-century trees was soon replaced by a more angular representation system, that of cladistics. Derived from the Greek word klados, meaning branch, clade theory constitutes an innovative classification based on a set of simple principles and is the origin of rather minimalist diagrams. Its development rendered almost all degrees of Linnean taxonomy obsolete: kingdom, genus, phylum. Only the species survived. These were replaced by a single classification unit, the clade. A clade unites species descended from a common ancestor and sharing a distinctive trait that appeared in that ancestor. Mammals, for instance, form a clade because they all descend from a single ancestor that began nursing its offspring. One of the advantages of cladistics is its disregard for the nature of criteria used in classification. DNA sequences have proven as relevant as bone processes in revisiting species genealogy through it. This strategy is truly straightforward. Even though it's possible to differentiate clades within clades and beyond discussions on how clades become individualized, a single basic idea governs its principle. Visually, this classification delivers simple and aesthetic trees composed of lines and bifurcations, with living species at the branch tips and their unknown, but assumed, ancestors at their base. A cladogram is as easy to draw as a tree and ultimately resembles the sole figure in On the Origin of Species. It might be a tree that the painter Piet Mondrian could have imagined. Cladistics revisited many assumptions underlying previous zoological classifications. The evolution it describes indeed forms a branching pattern, but it doesn't matter where or when a branching occurs. It doesn't envision a drive towards perfection. On a cladogram, one animal is never superior to another, it simply represents a point in a figure. Some species retain ancestral traits while others have inherited recent characteristics, all outcomes of diversity and natural selection. Each cladistic tree thus illustrates a transient hypothesis that temporarily supplants previous data until new data updated in turn. The conceptual purity of the cladogram lends it a beauty that captivates. Its simplicity, more prosaic than its ancestors, offers great flexibility in form and arrangement, as seen in Carol Ballinger's work, Tree of Life, Homage to Darwin. While cladograms lack the same visual symbolism as 19th-century trees, today's zoologists feel that their simplicity reflects genuine scientific clarity. Alongside the ongoing evolution of concepts, many contemporary trees no longer resemble traditional trees. Going beyond cladistics, phenetics doesn't claim to establish evolutionary relationships among animals. Instead, it aims to quantify similarities between species, often using mathematical algorithms run by computers. Echoing zoologists of the early 19th century who described vague affinities among animals rather than true affiliations, these new classifications convey the hope that similarities may one day testify to real evolutionary relationships. Instead of forming a tree with an individualized trunk, recent classifications often now resemble a network of lines whose lengths are proportional to calculated dissimilarities between the species they connect. The result is an irregular, rootless shape, with species protruding from its periphery. These chaotic explosions of interrelationships between species reflect zoologists' ambition to think big, with many attempting to create radiant constructions connecting all forms of life. These giant trees generally rely on genetic information, as DNA is one of the few things shared by all living beings. Some present a small branch with 3 small buds, Homo, Saccharomyces, and Z. Ultimately, we humans, often self-absorbed, reintegrate our place, relegated to a tiny outpost in a sprawling network of organisms, not far from our close cousins, molds and corn. Edwin Goodrich, a professor at Oxford, worked during a time when knowledge in anatomy and embryology was advanced but had not yet been revolutionized by the breakthroughs in genetics and molecular biology. He traveled extensively across the globe, dedicating himself particularly to studying the anatomical organization of various marine organisms. His research focused on the secretory, excretory, and reproductive tubes that connect the inside of the body to the outside, and on the complex equivalences between these structures across different groups. Goodrich succeeded in developing the most relevant framework for understanding the evolution of the anatomical plan of vertebrates and its development during embryonic life, at least prior to the advent of molecular genetics. He filled gaps in fossil records, effectively putting to rest arguments claiming that the evolution of vertebrate bodies was not consistent. His illustrations show his significant influence on the knowledge of vertebrate morphology. For instance, in a detailed depiction of the mosaic of cranial bones in a fish, one can discern the few bones that still persist in the skulls of mammals. Other illustrations by Goodrich depict the evolution of the vertebrate cardiovascular system, transitioning from a structure with a single ventricle and atrium to a bilateral system with a double circulation circuit, one for the lungs and another for the body. Additionally, he illustrated the evolutionary development of the pelvis, from dinosaurs to birds.